Welcome back to Hardball. Any doubt that Benghazi is a fundraising, base-mobilizing boondoggle for Republicans was erased today. The National Republican Congressional Committee, which fights for Republicans to get elected to the House, sent out this fundraising email. Stand with Congressman Trey Gowdy, the Benghazi Select Committee, and House Republicans as we fight for the truth about what happened with the Benghazi terrorist attack. Help fight liberals by donating today. It sounds like Rush Limbaugh. And earlier today, House Speaker John Boehner, who called for the establishment of a select committee to investigate Benghazi, reinforced that it would be Republicans' main vehicle. It would be their main vehicle of attack this November.
When is the administration going to tell the American people the truth? They've not told them the truth about Benghazi. They've not told the truth about the IRS. They've not told the truth about Fast and Furious. Now, only one would have to guess. If they're not willing to tell the American people the truth, it must not be very pretty. Thanks.
I think it was Jack Nicholson who said you can't handle the truth. Anyway, in the New Yorker, Jane Mayer, the great writer, recalls the string of attacks against American installations in Beirut, Lebanon, during Ronald Reagan's presidency back in the 80s. Mayer compares how lawmakers then investigated the attack versus what Republicans are doing now. Here's the timeline for what happened in Beirut in those years. April 18th, 1983, militants bombed the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, killing 63 people, including 17 Americans. October 23rd, 1983, a suicide bomber drove an explosive-laden truck into U.S. Marine compound in Beirut, killing 241 servicemen. March 1984, 3 months after Congress issued a bipartisan report on the Marine barracks bombing, militants again struck, this time American officials in Beirut, kidnapping, torturing, and murdering a CIA station chief. And in September 1984, for third time in 13 months, jihadists bombed a U.S. outpost in Beirut. Again, 23 people were killed, including 2 Americans. Following the horrific bombing of the Marine barracks, a bipartisan House committee investigated. Jane Mayer writes, Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House, was no pushover. He, like today's opposition leaders in the House, demanded an investigation, but a real one, and only one. Instead of playing it for political points, a House committee undertook a serious investigation into what went wrong at the barracks in Beirut. 2 months later, it issued a report finding very serious errors in judgment by officers on the ground, as well as responsibility up through the military chain of command, and called for better security measures against terrorism in U.S. government installations throughout the world. In other words, Congress actually undertook a useful investigation and made helpful recommendations. Well, David Corns, an MSNBC political analyst, and Brian Katulis is senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. And David, and I know, Brian, you're both up to date on this. I remember it. I'm just going to start with this. How after the horrific bombing of our Marine barracks in October of '83, Speaker O'Neill, Tip O'Neill, my boss, stuck with the president. He said, we're not bugging out, we're sticking with him. And they stayed together on this without any real finger pointing all the way through until the following year. And it wasn't until Reagan basically said, we're pulling out, but didn't tell anybody, and went after Tip for saying we should pull out, that it got bitter and negative. But for a long period there, including the period in which they had this committee investigating it, it was bipartisan. Your thoughts, David?
Well, you know, Chris, that was a great example of government working as it should. And it's not the only example. After 9/11, Democrats and some Republicans in Congress pushed for an independent, bipartisan, fully bipartisan commission, the 9/11 Commission, and we're all familiar with the great job it did. And also during the Iran-Contra investigation, Arthur Lyman, who was the director, the staff director of the Senate committee, which was controlled by Democrats, said very early on, we're not going to get into impeachment on this, even though some members of Reagan's own circle feared that it might be impeachable. So he right away took politics out of this. So again and again and again, we have really good examples in history of a tragedy happening, an investigation being put underway to see what happened and to prevent it from happening again. Not investigations into talking points, not having the House Speaker come out and saying they're lying. Where? You know, John Boehner should not be allowed to say that without coming forward and saying what is the lie? What did they get wrong? And, and evaluating it.
Brian, not only are they raising money on this, the way they sell the story is that Chris Stevens and the other Americans are dead because of the Democrats' PR campaign. An absurd sort of taking from what happened afterwards, which they can argue about, to what happened at the time. They keep trying to turn it, conflate it, the old right-wing trick that they got us in the war with, conflate it. and somehow make this absurd charge that how it was described afterwards on Meet the Press somehow led several days earlier to the death of Chris Stevens and the other Americans. And this is what O'Neill, Tip O'Neill, my boss, never did back then. During those debates, there was never any. And in 9/11, as David points out, nobody's running around saying that somebody had to be blamed. They tried to understand how this thing could happen. Terrorism was coming at us, and we tried to figure it out before we decided whose fault it was. Your thoughts? Right.
Look, I just got back from Beirut a couple of days ago, and I saw our ambassador there. I saw our diplomatic personnel. Our exclusive focus should be protecting these individuals. These individuals are serving and sacrificing for our country. And this investigation that's just been announced has nothing at all to do about enhancing the security and the effectiveness of our diplomatic professionals. It is simply the Republican Party trying to raise money off the deaths of 4 Americans who were serving their country in Benghazi. And we've had multiple investigations, 25,000 pages of reports coming from investigations. And the State Department, the DOD, the Pentagon, others have enhanced their procedures. They've learned from the mistakes that were made. And there were mistakes made in Benghazi, but there's no cover-up. But my main point is this. Those people who are sitting in our embassies overseas, that should be our exclusive focus. And that's not what the Republican Party is talking about right now.
You know, in graphic and big-time terms, we're talking about Beirut and the particulars back then in 83 and 84. But, David, it seems to me that the Democrats never, you know, crassly blamed W for 9/11. They've joined in a bipartisan, but really truly bipartisan campaign to go to Afghanistan and try to get the people who were behind it. They really did try to get together and try to catch bin Laden. They was all united. I mean, after this tragedy, the reaction has been, how can we blame the other side? And it's really different, not just from Beirut, but from all the coal, all these tragedies. Sure, every time you get hit by terrorists, by definition, it's going to be by surprise. By definition, it's going to be where you don't expect it. And you're going to get hit, and you're going to have to deal with it and pay for it. People are going to get hurt and killed. And you don't go on every single time and try to raise money on it, I don't think.
Hey,
That's
Chris,
not good politics.
Remember back with the Beirut attack, particularly the one on the Marines, that at that point in time, Reagan and others had been warned that keeping the Marines deployed in that fashion could lead to a major disaster. Yet he still did it, and we lost 241 lives on top of the other dozens that came before and after. And even after that, Democrats were not out there calling, you know, for his impeachment or calling for his scalp. They were looking at what happened and what went wrong on the ground in the chain of command, and they didn't make it a campaign issue. You could even argue that they should have, but they chose not to. And it seems to me that this notion that we band together after something goes wrong, try to figure out what happened and how to make things improve is totally out the window, and it's all about getting out the base, appealing to the most extreme elements of the Republican Party. Oh, yes. And making a buck. And does that surprise anyone at this stage of the game? I hope it doesn't.
It's like being on a ship somewhere, a warship, and you've just been attacked, and instead of responding with gunfire, you sit around the deck of the ship complaining about who didn't see them coming. That's what we're doing now. Anyway, thank you, David Corn and Brian Katulis. Coming up, a side of Hillary Clinton we don't usually see. That's next in the sideshow. And this is Hardball, the place for politics.